You are only fit to keep toilets running. My rich brother humiliated me in front of his friends. I always thought my brother Justin had my back. He was a golden child, the one with the straight A's, the scholarships, the Wall Street job. Mom always said he was special, and I believed it, until I realized he thought I was just some second-rate family member. The poor relation. We grew up in the same house, shared the same bunk bed as kids, spent summers at the lake fishing and getting into trouble. But somewhere along the way, our paths split. Justin went off to Ivy League glory, and I stayed in town, building my own plumbing business from scratch. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. The kind that keeps the world running while guys like Justin move money around on a screen. I work hard, long hours, weekends, middle-of-the-night emergency calls. And I don't mind. There's something satisfying about fixing something with your own hands, knowing people rely on you when their pipes burst at 2 in the morning. My truck might not be fancy, but it gets the job done. My house isn't a mansion, but it's mine. And that's more than a lot of people can say. Justin, he wears suits that cost more than my mortgage payment, drives a sleek BMW, and spends weekends at exclusive golf clubs. He talks about equity markets and diversification strategies like normal people talk about the weather. We don't see each other much these days, just the occasional holiday or Mom's birthday. And every time I do, I remember why I keep my distance. This time was no different. Mom invited us both to a family dinner, but when I walked in, I knew it wasn't just family. Justin had brought his friends, shiny, polished people who looked like they belonged in some finance magazine. The kind of people who talked about investments over stake and saw manual labor as something you pay someone else to do. I was barely through the door when Justin clapped me on the back like we were old pals. "Hey, Mike, how's life in the trenches?" The words dripped with something I couldn't quite place. Not outright mockery, just enough to let me know my job was beneath him. I shrugged it off. Pays the bills. Dinner was worse. We sat around Mom's oak dining table, the one she's had since we were kids, and while she served up a roast with all the fixings, Justin and his friends served up the usual condescension. "Oh, Mike, you must have the strongest hands from all that pipe wrenching. Hey, man, if this finance thing doesn't work out, maybe I'll come work for you." Just kidding. I don't think I could handle getting my hands dirty. It wasn't just the words. It was the smirks, the chuckles, the way they looked at each other like I was some kind of novelty act. I glanced at Mom, hoping she'd say something. Instead, she gave me that awkward smile, the one she always gave when Justin was being, well, Justin. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't just sibling teasing. It wasn't playful. Justin wasn't just making jokes. He was making a point. In front of his high-class friends, I was the entertainment, the lesser brother, the one he could parade around as proof of how far he'd come. I pushed my plate away, appetite gone, my jaw clenched, my fingers tightening around the fork. I could let it slide like I always did, laugh it off, or I could make it clear that I wasn't some side act in the Justin show. And the worst part, Mom wasn't going to stop him. Some people are just meant to be poor. That's what Justin said between sips of his expensive wine, and the whole table erupted in laughter. My face burned, but I kept my mouth shut, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping me from walking out. The steak on my plate was cold. Mom's fancy china, the kind she only used for special occasions, felt out of place for a night like this. The candles flickered, casting a warm glow over polished silverware and overpriced wine glasses. It was the kind of dinner where people talked about stock portfolios and beach houses, not fixing leaky pipes or pulling double shifts. Justin was in rare form. He leaned back, flashing that easy, confident grin, and launched into a story about how, when we were kids, I used to tell everyone I'd be a millionaire by 30, how I draw pictures of mansions and sports cars, talking big about the future. His voice dripped with amusement, like it was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. I didn't recognize half the people at the table, but they laughed right along with him. Man, I remember when Mike swore he'd be richer than me one day. Said he'd have a bigger house, a nicer car, the whole deal. Guess that didn't quite work out, huh? A guy across from me smirked, shaking his head. That's tough, man. But hey, plumbing's solid work, right? Keeps the toilets running. More laughter. Another jab. Another reason to grit my teeth and pretend it didn't bother me. Mom shifted uncomfortably at the head of the table, eyes darting between us like she wanted to step in but wouldn't. Or maybe she just didn't want to ruin the evening. I wasn't sure which was worse. Justin's girlfriend, some Instagram-perfect woman with a diamond bracelet that probably cost more than my truck, gave me a pitying look. At least you're your own boss, right? That's something. The way she said it, like she was talking to a kid who just announced he tied his own shoes, made my stomach twist. I wanted to fire something back, something sharp enough to wipe the smugness off Justin's face. But I knew how this worked. If I pushed back, I'd be the bitter one, the one who couldn't take a joke. So I did what I always did. I let it slide. I picked up my glass, drained the last of my beer, and stared at the clock on the wall. Dinner dragged on. More finance talk, more inside jokes, more reminders that I didn't belong at this table. My appetite was long gone, replaced by something heavier in my chest. When Justin started another story about how I once tried to start a landscaping business as a teenager, but failed spectacularly, I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, loud enough to make the conversation stutter for half a second. I gotta go. No one asked me to stay. I didn't say goodbye, didn't look at Justin, didn't wait for Mom to say something. I just walked out. The night air hit my face like a slap. My truck was parked down the street, and I climbed in, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I'd spent years thinking Justin and I were just different, that we lived in separate worlds, but deep down, we were still brothers. But sitting at that table, listening to him tear me down while everyone laughed, I finally understood. This wasn't new. He'd always looked down on me. I just never wanted to see it. I was done. Done playing the good brother. Done pretending Justin's jokes didn't get under my skin. That night, as I gripped the steering wheel of my truck, I made a decision. I wasn't wasting another ounce of energy on someone who didn't respect me. The next morning, I ignored his texts. No snarky responses, no explanations. Just silence. It felt good. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything to him. A week passed, then two. I skipped family dinner, let Mom's calls go to voicemail, and kept my head down at work. Justin didn't seem to notice at first. Then the messages started changing. You really upset Mom. Maybe grow up and stop sulking. So, you're really mad over a couple of jokes? Pathetic. I guess you're just gonna ghost your own family now. Real mature. The guilt trips rolled in like clockwork. Classic Justin. Always the one in control. Always the one calling the shots. But this time, I wasn't playing along. I wasn't the same kid who used to follow him around, hoping for approval. I had my own life, my own business, and I was doing just fine without his validation. And then, just when I thought I was completely free of him, life threw me a curveball. I landed a massive contract, one that would set my business up for years to come. A local construction company needed a reliable plumber for a long-term project, and my name was at the top of their list. Steady work, big paychecks, and the chance to expand. It was everything I'd been grinding for. The first thing I did, I bought a new truck. A Ford F-150, fully loaded, sleek black with all the upgrades. The kind of truck Justin used to scoff at. The kind he said was for guys who peaked in high school. I parked it right outside my shop, took a step back, and let the moment sink in. I'd built this. On my own. No trust fund, no handouts, no fake smiles at dinner parties. That night, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Justin. Nice truck. Guess plumbing pays better than I thought. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. A few days later, Mom called again. This time, I picked up. Her voice had that tired edge to it, like she was bracing for an argument. "Honey, I don't like what's happening between you and your brother. Can't you two just talk? He's family." Family. That word had been stretched so thin it barely meant anything anymore. I sighed, rubbing my temple. "Mom, I'm not going to be his punching bag anymore. I'm done." Silence. Then a soft sigh. "I just want my boys to get along." I didn't have the heart to tell her that ship had sailed a long time ago. The next week, I pulled into my usual diner for breakfast. Small town spot, good coffee, people who knew your name. As I slid into my usual booth, I caught sight of Justin's BMW pulling up outside. He stepped out, dressed sharp as always, scanning the parking lot before walking in. I tensed, ready for another round of condescending remarks. But when he slid into the seat across from me, there was no smug grin, no cocky attitude, just a heavy silence. "So, what? You just cutting me out of your life?" he finally said, stirring his coffee without looking at me. I met his gaze, calm and steady. "Unless something changes, yeah," he scoffed, shaking his head. "That's real mature, maybe, but it's working for me." For once, he didn't have a comeback. Just sat there, drumming his fingers against the table. And in that moment, I knew I didn't need his approval. Never did. A couple of weeks later, my phone rang. It was Mom. She sounded off, like she had been crying or was trying not to. She wasted no time getting to the point. "Justin's in trouble." I didn't say anything at first. Part of me wasn't surprised. The guy had always lived like money would never run out, flashing cash like it grew on trees. Turns out, that tree had finally been chopped down. Mom said he had fallen behind on rent, maxed out his credit cards, and even sold his car. The fancy life, the suits, the dinners at five-star restaurants. It was all a house of cards, and now it was collapsing. She hesitated before saying what I knew was coming. "Maybe you could help him? Just a little. He's your brother." I almost laughed. After everything, she still thought it was my job to bail him out. "Mom, those are his problems, not mine. He made his choices." She didn't like that answer. She sighed, disappointed but not surprised. "I just don't want to see my son homeless." I let her words sit for a moment. Justin had spent years acting like he was better than me, like my job and my life were beneath him. Now, he was the one scraping by, and she wanted me to fix it. "He's got options, Mom. He'll figure it out." She sniffed, her voice quieter now. "I know he hasn't been kind to you, but he's still family." I knew she meant well, but that word, family, felt like an excuse, a free pass for years of belittling and smug condescension. "I gotta go, Mom. Talk later." I ended the call before she could argue. For the next week, I kept my head down. Work was busier than ever, and I wasn't about to let Justin's problems take up space in my life. If he was smart, he'd find a way to get back on his feet. If not, well, that wasn't my problem. But life has a way of forcing things to the surface, whether you want it or not. It was late Thursday afternoon when my shop door flew open. The bell above the entrance clanged violently, and before I even looked up, I knew who it was. Justin stood in the doorway, and for the first time in my life, he didn't look like the guy who had it all together. He looked wrecked. His suit was wrinkled, his hair a mess, and there were dark circles under his eyes. I took a slow breath, setting down the invoice I had been working on. He wasn't here to make jokes this time, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear what he had to say. Justin stood in the middle of my office, shoulders slumped, eyes darting around like he was trying to find the right words. But I already knew why he was here. "You're not going to leave your own brother in the dirt, right?" His voice was rough, and not in the usual confident way. This was desperation, raw and unfiltered. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. My employees were still in the shop, probably overhearing every word. I didn't care. "You really came all the way down here to ask me for money?" After everything, I kept my voice even controlled. His jaw tightened. I don't have anyone else to ask. That wasn't my problem. He had spent years surrounded by so-called friends, people who toasted to his success and laughed at his jokes. Where were they now? I shook my head. You lived big, Justin. You made sure everyone knew it. Now, you want me to clean up the mess. His face darkened. So, what? You're enjoying this? Getting back at me. That hit a nerve. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. I'm not enjoying anything. I just don't owe you a bailout. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Right, because I was such a terrible brother. Because I made some jokes. I stood up. You made it clear you thought I was beneath you. Now, you're standing in my office, asking for help. Think about that. His nostrils flared, and for a second, I thought he was going to swing at me. But then his shoulders sagged, and he looked down. I just need some time. Just enough to get things sorted. I wasn't going to budge. You figure it out, just like I did. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. Without another word, he turned and walked out. For a moment, I just stood there, exhaling. I'd expected anger, but seeing Justin like that, completely drained, was something else. That night, I sat in my truck outside my house, staring at the dashboard. I wasn't happy about how things went, but I wasn't about to let him drag me down with him. A couple of days later, my phone buzzed. Not Justin. Someone else. Hey, man, you got a second? It's about your brother. It was one of Justin's old finance buddies. His voice was low, cautious. He's in deep, real deep, and the people he owes? They're not the kind you want to mess with. My grip tightened around the phone. How bad is it? The guy hesitated. Bad enough that they're looking for him. And if they don't find him soon, well, let's just say he's out of time. I let out a slow breath, staring out into the night. Justin had always played with fire. Looked like this time, he finally got burned. A week passed, and the silence felt heavier than usual. I hadn't heard from Justin since he walked out of my office. Not a call, not a text. Part of me wanted to check in, but I forced myself to push that thought aside. He had made his choices, and I wasn't about to be dragged into his mess. Then one evening, my phone rang. Mom. Her voice was shaky, barely holding it together. Michael, he's taking my things. My jewelry. He says he needs the money. I closed my eyes and pinched the bridge of my nose. Justin was circling the drain. First his savings, then his car. Now he was raiding our mother's house. Did you call the police? My voice was flat, tired. Michael, he's your brother, she said through tears. He needs help. I let out a slow breath. I wasn't sure if I was more angry at him for sinking this low or at her for still trying to defend him. I can't do this, Mom. He's not my responsibility. She sobbed quietly. I just don't know what to do anymore. I sat there, gripping the phone, staring at the wall. A long silence stretched between us before she finally whispered, I'm scared for him. That stuck with me. I wanted to tell her he'd figure it out, that he had to, but for the first time, I wasn't so sure. I hung up and tossed my phone onto the couch. I tried to shake it off, focus on anything else, but my gut told me this wasn't over. The next morning, my phone buzzed. A message from Justin. I need help. Just that. 2 words. No arrogance, no excuses. Just a simple plea. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the keyboard. Every instinct told me to ignore it. He had burned every bridge, trashed every second chance. And yet, that night, I found myself sitting in my truck outside Mom's house. I don't even remember making the decision to drive there. Maybe some part of me still believed he could turn things around. Maybe I just needed to see for myself how bad it had gotten. The house was dark except for the porch light. Mom had probably gone to bed early, exhausted from all of this. I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel. I exhaled, hit call, and put the phone to my ear. For the first time in his life, Justin didn't start with sarcasm or bravado. His voice was quiet, almost hollow. I ruined everything. His voice was different. Hollow. No bravado, no sharp edges. Just a man who had run out of moves. I ruined everything. I didn't say anything right away. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like, "and I told you so," and I wasn't here for that. What happened? I finally asked. A long pause. I could hear him exhale, like he was trying to keep it together. Might lose the apartment. Creditors are all over me. I don't even have a car anymore. Been bouncing between couches. His voice cracked just a little. I don't know what to do, man. For the first time in our lives, he sounded like someone who didn't have a plan. No backup strategy, no safety net, just raw fear. So what now? I kept my tone even, trying not to let emotion cloud my judgment. I just need a loan, just something to get back on my feet. I swear I'll pay you back. Every penny. I closed my eyes. This was the moment I had been dreading, but also the one I knew was coming. The last test. I can't, Justin. I'm not your safety net anymore. Silence. Then a quiet, almost resigned, "I get it." No arguing. No manipulation. Just those two words. For a second, I almost felt worse than if he had fought back. This wasn't the same brother who had thrown jabs at me across the dinner table. This was someone who had finally run out of options. "Take care of yourself," I said, then ended the call before I could change my mind. The next few weeks were quiet. Too quiet. Then one afternoon, I ran into an old friend of his at a coffee shop. The guy looked uneasy, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Man, have you talked to Justin?" I frowned. "Not in a while." "Why?" He let out a breath. He lost his apartment, been crashing on couches, barely getting by. A cold weight settled in my gut. Justin had finally hit rock bottom, and for the first time, I didn't know if he could pull himself back up. A month passed. Life moved on, at least for me. Work kept me busy, and I buried myself in it, trying not to think about Justin or what had become of him. I told myself I had done the right thing, that cutting him off was the only way he would ever learn. Then, one morning, I checked my email and saw his name. Justin. For a second, I just stared at it. My gut told me to ignore it, to delete it without reading, but my fingers moved on their own. I clicked. It wasn't long. No excuses, no blaming. Just a letter that felt more honest than anything he'd ever said to my face. He wrote about how he had spent his whole life trying to prove he was better, how he had looked down on me because deep down, he was afraid I was the one who had it figured out, not him. How he had burned every bridge, and only now, standing in the ashes, did he realize what he had lost. "You were always better than me, and I couldn't admit it. I see that now." He talked about sleeping on friends' couches, about how people who once called him family didn't even return his calls. He had no job, no plan, and for the first time in his life, no idea how to fix it. I spent years thinking success was about looking the part, about making people believe I had it all together. But the truth is, I was barely keeping my head above water. And you? You were the only one who never faked it. I read it twice, maybe 3 times. Then I sat back and stared at the screen, not sure what I was supposed to feel. Anger? Pity? Relief? I had spent years waiting for an apology. Now that I had won, I didn't know what to do with it. A part of me wanted to respond, to tell him it was okay, that he could fix this if he really tried. Another part of me wasn't sure if I could trust him again. Words were just words. Actions, that was where it counted. I closed the laptop, stared out the window at the morning light creeping over the rooftops. Somewhere out there, Justin was figuring out what came next, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be part of that story anymore. Maybe this wasn't the end of our story, but I wasn't ready to write the next chapter just yet.